Welcome back to the Stigma podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Hayes, and today's guest is John Donoghue. John is a neuroscientist. He is a professor of neuroscience and engineering at Brown University, and he is well known for his groundbreaking work around brain-computer interfaces, which is what we will be talking about today. Many people consider John to be the founder of not just a company, but of the entire discipline of what is called neuroprosthetics, which is the discipline related to neuroscience and biomedical engineering concerned with developing neural prosthesis. Most people know of this field or this work as brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs for short. John's work on BCIs is centered around translational research in human brain-computer interfaces to restore movement for people with paralysis. And that a lot of that work is known as BrainGate, as well as fundamental research to explain how networks of cortical neurons compute actions from plans that we make in our brain, or planned actions that we intend to take. BrainGate was the original BCI system owned by a company co-founded by John called Cyberkinetics, which designed BCIs to help people who had lost control of limbs or other bodily functions. Eventually, that work would end up being the basis for the current BCI market leader, BlackRock Microsystems, which is funded by Peter Thiel, Christian Angermeyer, and others focused on broadening what is possible with BCIs and making them accessible to millions of people in the future. John's work has been honored with countless awards both here in the U.S. and internationally. John was even tapped by President Barack Obama to be on the National Institute of Health Advisory Committee for the White House BRAIN Initiative during the Obama administration. It's an honor and a privilege to get to have John here with us today and to get to have him help us learn more about BCIs and what they can do and what they will do for humans in the future. Without further ado, let's get into it. John, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you, Stephen, for inviting me. It's really a great pleasure to just recently get to know you through an introduction of a mutual friend, and then to be able to participate in your podcast is really wonderful.
Well, I'm excited to have you here. And I thought what we would do is we would start by having you tell us a little bit about your history, your bio background, and how you found your way into the world of brain-computer interfaces.
So there's a long saga, but just to be brief, I have trained as a biologist and fell in love with trying to understand how the brain works, particularly the parts in the cerebral cortex, that the parts that I used to say, or I do say, makes us smart. That led to working a little bit as a technician, and then going on to graduate school, where I studied not only how brains function, but also how they might change, how they're changed by experience, by plasticity mechanisms that make them change. And as a way to sort of get my hands on what the brain was doing, I became very interested in the motor system and movement. And that's an attractive system because you can measure things. You know, when you move, you produce a force, you move your hand from one place to another, you shape your hand. All those things can be measured, so we could peer inside the brain and try to understand how the brain puts all that together. But I use that as a sort of substrate for understanding, how does emotion affect us? How do we think? How do we remember? With the motor system as sort of a construct to understand the whole system. So in the process of training at Brown University for graduate school, and then at the NIH, where I did postdoctoral work, we began to look at the relationship between brain activity and behavior. And one of the things we realized is that we didn't have the technology to understand the brain as a whole. At that time, the biggest approach to look at the relationship between behavior and neurons in the brain was to study one neuron at a time. And that's sort of like trying to understand an opera, for example, by just listening to one part. So it's very difficult, without the context of the whole system. So I started developing and started working with others to develop ways of studying the brain more than one cell at a time. And long story short, over the years, we began to understand how the brain controlled movement, not just me, of course, but a large number of people contributing. And we began to develop technology that allowed us to listen in on many brain cells at a time. Many these days is about 100. We can talk more about how that's expanding. So at some point, as we were doing experiments, these were basic science experiments to understand how the lots of neurons in the cortex were producing movements, controlling movements. we realized that we had a technology that we had developed, which was a multi-electrode array. It's basically a device that allows you to listen in on lots of neurons at the same time. And we also had an understanding of how the brain was sort of synthesizing movement. And again, I want to emphasize when I say we, I mean, many, many people working across the field. And then in about the late 1990s, my students in the lab, and we were all sitting around saying, we could really put this to good use. We could help a person who is paralyzed, a person who can't move because their spinal cord was damaged or they had a stroke. And we could read out their brain signals with this technology we had developed and with the understanding we had of movement. And we could plug it back into something that they might like to do, like control a computer or type on a computer or even control a robot arm. So when they can't move, they can have a robot do what they want. Or lastly, we could have someone control their own arm by taking the brain signal, bypassing the lesion, the damage in the nervous system, and going straight to the arm muscles, which very often are still intact in people who have, say, spinal cord injury. And we could directly control the muscles. And I'll tell you here that we actually have accomplished all those things. And I think that was, in a nutshell, that was 35 years of developing technology, doing basic science, and then leading up to human clinical trials where we've made some very impressive accomplishments that will, and they haven't yet, but will lead, I think, to devices that are very helpful for people who have various types of motor impairment. And by extension, I think we can use the same technology to apply that to a whole range of other disorders, including disorders of cognition, disorders of mood.
Wow, that's impressive. It gives me a lot of hope that there's some really earth-shattering solutions that are coming on the horizon for not just physical health, but mental health because of what's happened in the field where you are, the field that I mean, you've created this field, and it sounds like the brain-computer interface field is going to lead to things that really revolutionize the human experience.
Exactly. I think when we started, there was a lot of discussion, a lot of controversy. Are we ready to move this technology into humans? But now the field is exploding. There's a lot of investment in the field. There are a lot of people starting up companies to try to apply this technology. And there's a lot of important science being done that lays the groundwork for not only using this again to restore movement for people with paralysis, but also to apply this same technology to a whole range of other disorders, what I call disorders of higher brain function.
So I'm going to zoom out real quick. I definitely want to get into, I have so many follow-up questions to ask you about everything you've already said. So for the average person like me, can we start with what exactly is a brain-computer interface? How can we envision what that even looks like and what are the basics of it?
Sure. So it's a little bit of a tough question because even the definition of what it is sort of evolved over time. But fundamentally, a brain-computer interface is a way to interface with the brain and either pick up signals, read out what it's doing, or sometimes intervene in the brain, that is, modify what it's doing, and take those signals to the outside, interpret them because they're like listening to a foreign language, very complicated, interpret them, which in the neuroscience jargon is called decoding, and then take the brain signals, decode them, and then put them to use. What does that mean? It means turn them into a control signal that can control anything. For example, could be turn on the lights. It could be control your computer, pointing and clicking or typing, or it could be controlling a robot, like a robotic arm, and make the robotic arm pick up a glass of water when you can't. Or to control your own arm, for example, activate a stimulator that stimulates your muscles so that the muscles will act in a coordinated way so you can once again use your own hand again if you were paralyzed. So 3 basic parts: the sensor, or the thing that interacts with the brain; the decoder, which is typically a computer that translates brain speak into some control language; and then a machine to do something. And sometimes that machine is actually to go back in the brain and control the brain itself. So a brain signal is picked up. It says, this signal isn't quite right. I can intervene in the brain with stimulation and make it make it work properly. That is just on the cutting edge of what we're trying to do now to make brain circuits that don't work right work properly again. Now, just one other important point. These interfaces with the brain come in a whole variety of types. And the types change in the level of resolution. And the basic principle is the tinier the electrode, the tinier the connection to the brain, and the more of them there are, and the closer you are to the brain itself, the better the signal. It's kind of like listening to a conversation or listening to the opera again. If you're 16 miles away, even with a good microphone amplifier, things don't sound like much. As you get closer and closer, things are better. So there are what are called implantable electrode arrays, which basically is like a bunch of hair-thin probes that go into the brain itself. And those can listen in on individual brain cell messages or conversations. Then there are other electrodes that can go on top of the brain. And then there are others that can even go on top of the scalp. But by the time you go on top of the scalp with electrodes, many people know this is the EEG electrodes. They're sort of about a half the size of a penny electrodes that are all over the head in a cap. Those don't pick up a whole lot of detail. They pick up rumblings of what's going on inside your head. But for example, you can tell the difference between are you asleep or what stage of sleep you're in? Are you having an epileptic seizure? Or even in one part of the brain, you can tell whether your eyes are closed or open. So you can't tell a huge amount, but you can derive a lot from the outside. Again, the principle is the closer you get, the smaller the sensor, the more information you get. But of course, putting lots of tiny probes into your brain is a big deal. It's not something that you and I could just do whenever we want to. That's something that requires a neurosurgeon.
Yeah, brain surgery sounds complicated to me, and I think to the average person.
It does. But as I've learned, I'm not a neurosurgeon, but I have worked a lot with them. And the kinds of probes that are put into brains these days are actually not considered all that challenging an operation. It's not that difficult. And the complications are not that great. But nevertheless, everyone takes brain surgery seriously. When you're operating on someone, they're under anesthesia, they're having their skin and skull opened. These are serious things and only need to be done in cases where we can really help people with some condition.
So BCIs have been around for a while. Our understanding of them has advanced. Technology that we've created has allowed us to progress our capability in this field. Where are we today with BCIs? Are they in humans? Do they work? How do we know? Kind of what's the lay of the land today with this technology?
We can divide this into the implantables and the wearables. And I'm going to start talking about the implantables because they have so that really began in earnest around 2000. The very first human trials, a guy named Philip Kennedy had started with a couple of electrodes implanted in a person who was very severely disabled with an awful disease called ALS, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, where all of the neurons that connect to your muscles die. It's really a terrible progressive disease, but people can think, but they can't do anything. So he started, but the first cases of a person implanted with devices where there was a level of control was work that we did in the early 2000s. And we implanted this tiny 100 electrode array. So let me describe that. It's about the size of a baby aspirin. And it's a device that's a little platform that has 100 hair-thin probes that are only about a millimeter long. So they're just like a wisp of hair that's the amount you would get cut off in a trim at the barber shop. Very short. And the surgeon places those just into the surface of the brain in the right spot where movement signals are. And that procedure, which is still what's being done largely today, was done in the early 2000s. Matt Nagel was the first patient. It was part of what we call the BrainGate trial. And he was able to use the signals we collected from that little sensor to be able to control a computer. And he could do point and click movements of a cursor and be able to spell and answer email. The control of the cursor was okay. It wasn't terrific, but it was okay. And over the years, that kind of control has gotten a lot more sophisticated and a lot better. So early 2000s, things really began. I'd say that over the next 15 years, there was sort of continual development, demonstrations of more things that could be done, additional people with different types of paralysis, showing that you were able to achieve control with a brain-computer interface that got more and more sophisticated, from cursors on a screen to robotic arms doing complicated things to controlling a person's own arm. That sort of takes us right up to 2018 or so. In the last couple of years, there's been a lot of activity going on. One is to improve the sensors. Another one is to improve the decoders, that is, making more sense out of the information that comes out. And third is to expand the use of these signals to more and more sophisticated uses.
And what are some of the current uses? What are some of the near-term potential uses? How do you see this technology being used at a larger scale? Because what I understand is this has been used in humans, not in a lot of humans. I mean, a couple dozen, maybe a little bit more.
No, a couple of dozen is right.
How do we get to a place where this can be used for hundreds of thousands or millions of people?
So let's make sure we talk about the kind of two general applications of brain-computer interfaces, and this is where the terminology might get a little bit mixed up. So the kind of technology I'm talking about is where you read out the brain, you listen in. And where that's important is when people are trying to move, they can think about moving, or the brain is producing signals to move, but the signals can't get there. So there's a broken pathway. A stroke can do that. So the pathway that leads from your brain down to your spinal cord and then out to your muscles can be interrupted by a stroke in the brain or by an injury to your spinal cord. That affects hundreds and hundreds of thousands. There's about 700,000 people a year in the United States that have strokes, and about 10,000 a year that have spinal cord injury. So devices that we need to get that into that population. So I'd say, let's start by saying, first of all, proof of concept is done. You can get some level of control with these devices. They can be implanted for years. So why aren't they commercialized? So one is to process all those signals, especially because we have to do this largely on a lab budget. The devices we use are big and rather expensive, and they have to be on the outside of the body. So all of the people done so far, and we're beginning to see some changes, have a plug on their head and all the signals come out and to a box of computers that's the size of a small apartment refrigerator. And then the computers can churn and process this, and then that can be used to do whatever you want to do. So what we really need in order to have a commercial device is to take something and shrink that box of computers, or at least some parts of it, into something that can sort of fit under your skin, maybe wearable under the skin of the chest, like a cardiac pacemaker, if you know what those look like, or a device of that size that's just under your scalp. And we are just at the sort of cusp of that happening. So a wireless connection from the brain to the outside is one of the key steps, and that is something that's happening right now. There are people working, Elon Musk and Neuralink is one that's creating a device that will put most of those electronics inside a small package. That hasn't been tried in a human yet, but we're 1 or 2 or 3 years away from that happening. We also have been working on such a device. So that's one thing. The other one is the level of decoding. So we need to have, if, for example, you want to restore the ability to control your hand well enough to type, the decoding we can do is not yet good enough to produce coordinated finger movements. So if I told you you could have brain surgery, have a small implant, let's pretend that the implantable wireless device is done and inside you, and you could grab a coffee cup where before you couldn't move your hand at all, would you do that? So we don't know. If I told you you could do everything you do now with your hand and we couldn't tell the difference sort of before and after, I'm sure people would accept this readily, but we're not quite there yet. So we need the wireless device, we need better control. Both of those things are progressing very quickly right now.
So you would say maybe we're a few years away from having the capability to do that, and then from there we would have to enter into a process where we tested that. How long would it take to then get it to sort of mass scale or get it to the hundreds of thousands or millions of people that could use it?
Yeah, so that means it needs to be adopted by some of the large medical device companies, which exist already, or what we need is a startup company with sufficient resources to be able to go out and do the last stages of development. So that couldn't be faster than 3 years, I think, but is more on a decade timescale. And I have to say, I'll admit, I'm a very optimistic person. I thought, and I have documentation from 2005, 2006, that I thought we were 3 years away then from something that would be useful. Now, on the other hand, there are communication interfaces. One of the members of the BrainGate group, Krishna Shenoy, who works with Lee Hochberg in our group, has developed a typing interface, which is just about as rapid at typing as you and me. So if someone is unable to speak, say has ALS and really wants a typing interface, that product could be done in very short order. So a few years away for that. If you want something that's much more complex, sort of my dream is that you can help a person who is totally paralyzed, can't do anything, say with one arm or one leg, and we could use a brain-computer interface that would restore movement so that person would be indistinguishable from you or me. They could do everything we do. That is a much longer time frame. In fact, that could be many decades away.
What are the interim steps that are achievable by some of these startups in the space? Because it seems like a lot of this work has been done academically. It seems like now Peter Thiel and Christian Angermeyer and Elon Musk and a lot of folks are putting capital to work to build commercial businesses to bring these to market. Sounds like the time horizon it could be 3 years, it could be 10 years. What has to happen for these companies? Like what are the milestones that are realistic for them to achieve with investor capital over the next 3, 5, 7 years?
Yeah, so I think we need to build an industry just like we've built other industries. We need the appropriate investment and we need the startups to come in and begin to build companies. But my personal belief, and this is very much a personal view, is that one of the problems we've had with this kind of technology is it is so complex. And it's a challenge that spans the clinical world, the engineering world, and the neuroscience world. And those three together are usually worlds that work independently. But in order for us to make successful devices, we need to have engineers that know the most cutting edge microelectronics. They know materials. They know, all the things that can be done with electronics that neuroscientists in their labs don't know about, or they can't afford to deal with. They can't build a chip easily because it's extremely expensive. Similarly, clinicians are not used to talking to engineers and basic neuroscientists. They sort of live in different domains. That's ending, fortunately. But particularly for this kind of an effort, you need all three of those to interact with each other. And my personal view is that what's held the field back is we don't have some kind of intermediate entity that can pick up the good ideas that have been developed in academic labs, provide them with the engineering and clinical knowledge that you need to, and money, really, lots of money, to develop those kinds of devices, test them initially in humans, and then say to the medical device startups or companies, here's something that it isn't done yet, but it's been shown that it works in humans. And that's when it becomes attractive to capital. And that valley of death that exists is a real problem, and I think is a real hindrance to the translation of great academic ideas into real world products. And I think we'll sort of stumble along, and many startup companies will fail because they don't realize how complicated brain signals are, how much work has to go into engineering these devices and building devices that do what we need done, and the clinical complexities of a trial that tests these devices and shows that they can do what the scientists think they can do. So it's a very complex space.
Where will that entity come from? Is that a government entity that needs to be created? Is that a nonprofit? Who should that organization be?
Yeah, so these are very much my own views, and my personal view is that the right place is a philanthropically supported entity, a nonprofit that's kind of big science, open science entity that will identify great ideas and then have the resources and this combined clinical neuroscience engineering know-how to take it to the commercial world. So I don't know how else this could be supported except philanthropically. I think typically government resources are not enough to do this. That's why sometimes these ideas languish in the academic world. And many, especially the big medical device companies, say, look, this stuff is a very interesting concept, but a 10-year development horizon of something that may not work is too risky for us.
That makes a lot of sense. And I can see investors wanting to be in this space, but being turned off by the idea that could be outside their time horizon. So I can see why philanthropic money would be needed.
Yeah, it sounds kooky.
It sounds pretty far out there.
Yes. So I think that's a case. Now, on the other hand, Musk has personal resources and other access to resources. And you take someone who has sort of a very ambitious view of the world, very impressive thinker of what we can do and willing to invest those resources. And I think that will be enormously helpful. There are a number of other companies that are attracting venture capital. I just think that, we will achieve these goals eventually. I think we could do it much faster if we had some kind of intermediate entity that would take us from the academic setting to the commercial setting.
And your original work BrainGate led to Cyberkinetics, and Cyberkinetics now lives inside of BlackRock. Is that right?
Kind of, yes. So my students and I in the early 2000s started Cyberkinetics. We were very lucky to be funded. We were very naive, but I think this was an early version of Neuralink, but we were too early for the field, and we didn't recognize, again, the same problem: the amount of resources that we needed, the amount of clinical data that had to be done, and the enormous complexity of the whole process. So, unfortunately, in 2008, Cyberkinetics ran out of money after several human proof of concept demonstrations. But we ran out of money. It was a very bad time to try to raise more money. And at that time, the assets and the rest of Cyberkinetics was picked up by BlackRock, and who has done an impressive job of continuing with the technology part. The clinical trial aspect was picked up. Actually, we brought it back to Brown University and Mass General Hospital, and it's now very ably led by Lee Hochberg, who's a critical care neurologist and neuroscientist who's managing that group, which really just grew out of my lab in 2000. So there's two aspects: the academic group that's running a clinical trial called BrainGate that's still ongoing, and BlackRock, which took over the sort of technical assets and still produces the technology. And virtually up until at present, virtually all the human high resolution studies of brain-computer interfaces uses that BlackRock technology. That's beginning to change. There are other companies working on alternative technologies that could replace the sensors that BlackRock is producing. And perhaps one of the most exciting advances, which is still a bit far off from human application, is the introduction of something called a neuropixel electrode. And what's really exciting about this electrode, which is now only for use in animals as a research tool, but if you imagine each of those little hairs that go into the brain, every time that's used as a sensor in the brain, the BlackRock technology, each electrode gives you one recording, one site. So their electrode array, for example, gives you 100 possible sites. This neuropixel electrode can have 1,000 sites on it. And this is a technological tour de force. This is beyond a dream that I ever had, that you could actually produce something like this. So instead of 100 insertions of a tiny electrode into a brain, you get, for 100 insertions, you could get 100,000 recording sites, which means you can listen into 100,000 more neurons and potentially get a much, much richer set of information about what the brain is doing. That kind of signal can lead us to understand what's going on with thought disorders, say like schizophrenia or depression, and certainly could help us derive better movement signals for people with paralysis.
When we had talked before, you had mentioned we started talking about this data throughput concept of getting more data out of the brain and then processing it. And one of the concepts you raised to me was like a thermodynamics problem around this data flow creating the byproduct of this is heat. And how will we get around problems like that? What are some of those sort of physics problems that we still have to solve or are being solved, and how do they come into play here?
So the big problem is, so if you could get neuropixel electrodes so that they could be used in humans and have hundreds of thousands of sites, which there are now a number of scientists that dream about doing this for devices in humans. When you collect that much data, you need the digital stream that would carry it requires a lot of power. Now, by some standards, it's not that much, but the big problem is getting that power in someplace. Batteries today are not big enough to last, say, transporting that much information over many years. Running those systems, the batteries and the whole systems get hot. And many people ignore that problem. But just as a practical milestone, the FDA says you can't change the local temperature around a device more than 2 degrees. And quite frankly, I don't think we really know how much heat the brain can take and over what area. So we know that 4, 5, 6 degrees of heat can cause seizures if your brain gets, warmed up. But exactly the dynamics of that is very complex. But nevertheless, it's, a very practical problem. When you convey a lot of information, you burn up a lot of power, you generate heat, and we need to find a way to either dissipate the heat or not produce it. And so we need clever tricks, but we can't violate physics. That's the bottom line is the physics limits us to what we can do. So this may ultimately, it's not I said that my dream electrode of 1,000 electrodes per one probe was an amazing tour de force. But the thing that will be the showstopper is the fact that it just gets too hot. It's something that, for example, when we were initially thinking about these systems, I had no thought at all that this would be a problem. And maybe one more problem is that the radio you need to send that much information is really quite sophisticated, and to send that much information over across the skin and outside the body is really complex. And there aren't radios that can achieve that can fit inside a tiny package and get powered sufficiently to go outside. So that's another big problem. And just another practical problem is you can't have it so that anybody walking by can pick up that signal and start reading out your brain. We want some level of privacy to that data that's coming out of your head.
It sounds like there's a lot of opportunity here. It sounds like there are a lot of problems to solve. And it looks to me like there's finally some entrepreneurs and some capital coming to this space to combine forces with the engineers and with the clinicians. And I'm kind of curious from your perspective, where do you see the opportunity set for an entrepreneur who wants to move fast and break things and disrupt, which are the buzzwords of the day in company building land? Where do you see the opportunity set for those types who want to be in this space and want to help bring these solutions to broad use for the public?
So once we have even, sort of the simplest devices to be able to process the brain signals and send them to the outside, which I said are coming very quickly. These won't be able to do thousands and thousands of channels of processing, but even hundreds could be valuable. So the real opportunity is for the entrepreneurs that are thinking about how can I apply this? So for example, for people with epilepsy, so there's already what's called a closed loop device that can pick up brain signals and then look to see whether a seizure is happening or ultimately about to happen. And it can make a decision to go in and stimulate a part of the brain that will help quiet the brain down so that a seizure won't occur. So that's one example of using the readout of the brain to control the brain itself. And now the opportunities, if we have the right technology and the right technology is available, to apply it to a whole range of other disorders. A big opportunity is in depression. Imagine now you could read out the brain and there was a readout signal that said, you've been doing fine for the past 3 months, but in the next few weeks, you're going to be depressed. The signals are all indicating in your brain that an episode of depression is coming. Then what you could do is if you could interpret such a signal, you could go in and modulate the circuitry that relates to depression. We know some of that circuitry. We need to know more, but we know some of it. And we even know that if we stimulate electrically in a few spots, it appears to relieve severe depression. It appears to help make it go away. So eventually we'll have devices that will intervene, will read out and then intervene in circuits. As I said, there's already a device for epilepsy. It's not perfect, but it's certainly a big advance. There's use in depression. Another opportunity, we know where, for example, in substance abuse, we know the parts of the brain that are, and the circuits that are very much involved in the reward mechanisms and abuse. And there's at least the beginnings of studies where you could stimulate, now it seems, a couple of places in the appropriate way in that circuitry to quell the desire for drug seeking. But we need to read out the brain that this episode is coming on, where there's a craving going to happen. And now we can manipulate that circuit in a way that suppresses that craving. There's some initial data that just came out. I think it's very early to make any strong conclusions. But I actually think that all of these things are possible. So once we have the tools, there'll be a dramatically huge space for people to be able to say, how can I apply this for control of eating disorders, thought disorders, memory disorders, mood disorders? And I think that space will be gigantic.
You had mentioned something a minute ago about the data security and privacy being a concern or something we have to think about. What else do we need to be mindful of here? What are the potential risks to advancing this technology that we should be considerate of as we sort of go deeper in this space?
Yeah, there's a very, very important ethical component in all of brain manipulation. So I think most neuroscientists would agree that the brain is, if not entirely us, is a good part of what we are. So if we can manipulate the brain to good, as I just described some of the ways we might help people with depression or anxiety disorders, if we can do that by manipulating the brain with implanted devices or other kinds of devices, could we manipulate the brain in another way? I don't like your personality. I'm going to stick a probe in your brain and change your personality. So that's so these are what are called dual use technologies. One is, of course, and the aim that we all have is, to benefit people with, severely disabling disorders. The other one is to manipulate people in various ways. I don't think we're close to detailed reading out of thoughts, but we can begin to get some inkling of what the brain is doing. We can already tell, what stage of sleep you're in or what you're intending to do for a movement. But with stimulation devices, that is probes that I haven't talked too much about, but probes you can put into a circuit in the brain and modify the way that circuit works. You can do positive things like help people with Parkinson's disease stop shaking, but you can also manipulate that circuit in a way that might change a person's personality. And that's, needs to be regulated. There is a very, very large and important ethical component to brain-computer interfaces. And there's also a growing community of neuroethicists who are, some of the people that I admire the most, who are looking at how do we regulate, how do we control the kinds of abilities that we'll get as we understand more about the brain and how to manipulate its function.
It's fascinating. It's really fascinating. What should I be asking from a basic layman's perspective, trying to understand brain-computer interfaces? I'm certain that I am not asking all of the right questions. What should I be asking?
Well, I think you've hit upon most of the important. The ethical component is very big and very significant, and could generate fear. So I think discussion about the ethical components, discussion about the technology itself and where is it going and what's possible and what's not possible. So, for example, we can't put brain-computer interfaces inside a syringe full of COVID vaccine and turn you into a magnetic person or control your body with that. That's not possible yet. So, separating, I think, talking about what's the sci-fi piece and what's the reality, where we are, where we'll go. I think the brain decoding aspect is the other one of, understanding the brain's language. And there's really a lot of space, not only just understanding it fundamentally, But what does it mean as we understand more and more detail about the brain? Can we learn about what is consciousness, or what does a thought actually look like? When you think about having a cheeseburger later on in the day, how is that constructed in your brain? So these are things that can emerge as we have devices that are in human brains and able to read out. We can start learning about what it looks like, how the brain actually puts information together. One of the things we found out that I was just intrigued me is that the part of the brain that I've studied the most, the motor cortex it's called, is a part that when you think about, for example, grabbing your coffee cup, this is the part that sort of sets that all up and gets it going. But what we found out was that if you do that in front of a person and they just watch you do it, it also activates that part of the brain. So it's watching and doing. So it's sort of a mimicry part of the brain. It's been called a mirror aspect. But, we learned this whole thing that the part of the brain that we thought of as mainly the sort of output post of the brain to run things is also very much a cognitive area, looking at the world and taking in views of action and reproducing them in your head.
You mentioned the decoding aspect. It brings up a little bit of a almost philosophical question for me, or maybe it's not philosophical, but how much of the brain do we understand? Is it a little? Is it a lot? Where are we on understanding the signals in the brain broadly?
Yeah, you have it exactly right. It's a little and a lot. So at some level, we understand quite a bit. I think the 1980s, 1990s was an area where we kind of cataloged brain cells. We went through brain cell at a time and asked, what do they do? And we see they sort of brain cells that do similar things all live together in a region in the brain next to each other. But we learned with fMRI, MRI techniques that show us sort of the whole human brain operating, that they talk to each other a lot, and they just don't talk to anybody, but they talk to select groups, sort of like an elitist club, So there are these organizational structures that sort of organize. So we know we're beginning to get principles of how the brain works. Individual neurons are important. Neurons communicate across wide areas to form these cliques or these groups that are important for different states of the brain. But how you, in fact, come up with an idea, how abnormal brain activities for behavior disorders, for other kinds of issues of mental health dysfunction, ADHD and things, we don't understand how those circuits go awry. We know that it's somehow the interaction of neurons. We know somehow that the circuitry is not working properly, but we don't understand the nature of those circuits. And one of the reasons why we don't understand those circuits is because it's somehow the complex interactions of many, many neurons. And I told you that we don't really have the tools to study how many, many neurons work together, although that's coming very quickly. Those tools are becoming available. And we also need the analytical tools. That is, if I said to you, here's the data from 100,000 neurons in your brain over the past half hour, how are you going to make sense of that? How are you going to just the pure processing power of taking all that information and pulling something out of it? If you use machine learning and artificial neural networks, it could take weeks, months, years to try to look for something in the brain. We need to know what to look for. So a lot of it is guided by, what is your theory of how the brain works? And then we can test those ideas. But we need analytical tools. They're also coming in parallel because now that it's possible to look at a lot of the brain at once, mathematicians, another important group in the whole sphere of neuroscience and neurotechnology, those individuals are motivated to come up with ways of looking at the way the whole thing is organized. It's very much like looking up at the stars. You can see, a few dots of light if you just look with the naked eye. As we get Hubble telescopes, we realize there's clusters of galaxies and millions of galaxies, and each of those has planets around each of the stars. And we can begin to use techniques like that are used even in astronomy to say how are these large systems organized? How are they interacting with each other?
How can we follow this space? Where's the cutting edge stuff happening? Where's the news? How does one follow this space and stay up to date on what's the latest and what's going on?
It's difficult to follow everything because, as I said, there's such a combination of fields, neuroscience, the clinical world, engineering. I just mentioned mathematics. So, it's not possible to read all the literature. It's just, overwhelming. There's more journals than there used to be papers when I was a student, so that's not possible. I think for those that are interested to look at where startups are popping up is a very interesting way to say, where's the cutting edge? Because, brilliant young neuroscientists or clinicians that are entrepreneurial minded are looking at saying, so what's possible within the sphere of what I can do, over my 3-6 year kind of activity that I'm trying to get going. So looking at what startups are doing is one way to do it. I think, I look at, the leading science journals, Science and Nature magazine, for example, will publish sort of what's the next discovery in science that, is sort of cutting edge of what's going on in the brain. There are a few industry reports that you can read. There's something called Neurotechnology Reports that's very useful because it keeps track of sort of what the industry is doing and what's being developed. Some of that, of course, is things that have been around a while and are making progress in, sort of the commercialization. But others, the startups particularly, as I said, are groups that are sort of looking at what's possible to do with what's either here now or what's coming in the near future.
And how can people get in touch with you, connect with you? What's the best way to connect with you for the folks that are listening?
Oh, I think at my Brown email address is the way to get in touch with me. And I'd be glad to help people find resources if they have particular interests.
Got it. And I will post your LinkedIn page and your email address in the show notes here for people that are listening, if that's okay with you. And I wanted to say thank you for doing this. Thank you for the work that you've done, for decades of work that you've done. Thank you for connecting with me. Thank you for sharing your thoughts here with us. I'm really, really grateful for everything you've done and for the fact that you would just take an hour out of your day to educate the average person on what the potential is for this incredible space. So just thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you, Stephen, for the opportunity, because I think this is one of the ways that we can disseminate this knowledge and let people know really what's happening now and what the potential is in the future, which I think is very bright and very exciting and worth knowing more about.
Thank you again, John, for being here today and sharing with us. Your work around brain-computer interfaces is truly groundbreaking. I believe it will lead to incredible advancements in the human experience. And it's really an honor to get to have you come here today and help us understand what's going on in this field and where it can go. There are a number of ways to get in touch with John, which he mentioned, which I will link to in the show notes. To our listeners, thank you for being here. And please, if you like our episode, if you like our content, please give us a subscribe or a like or a review on your podcast platform of choice. And more importantly, we'd love it if you would share this episode with a friend. To the founders out there in the mental health and the digital health space, don't forget to join the Mental Health Startup Slack community, which you can also find a link to in the show notes. And make sure you check out the What If Fellowship program, which is an 8-week accelerator that we've created. It's designed to help early stage mental health and digital health startups broadly validate their ideas, perfect their business plan, and prepare to pitch to investors. You can learn more about that through the fellowship tab on the What If Ventures website, and this will all be linked in the show notes. Finally, we want to hear from our listeners. Please do comment on social media and let us know what you liked, what you want to hear more of, what you disagreed with. You can reach out to us on Twitter at StigmaCast, on Instagram at Stigma Podcast. You can email us info@stigmapodcast.com, and you can find us on our website, stigmapodcast.com as well. Thank you for being here. And until next time, stay safe, be well, and thank you for your support.